Picture this. Rome, the year 190 AD. The empire stretches from the misted hills of Britannia to the deserts of Egypt, but its beating heart is here, in the marble palaces that crown the Palatine Hill. The night is cold, a knife-edged wind sweeping down from the Apennines, but inside the emperor's halls, the air suffocates with heat, firelight, and dread. Torches burn in bronze sconces, their smoke curling across ceilings painted with gods who no longer receive worship. The flames flicker against scenes of Hercules strangling serpents, Hercules slaying beasts, Hercules triumphant. For Commodus, the emperor of Rome, these are not myths, they are mirrors. The corridors echo with the sound of chains dragged across marble. The clang reverberates like the tolling of a bell, calling not to prayer but to degradation. From hidden chambers, guards emerge, pushing men and women into the torchlight. Some are courtesans, painted with rouge and kohl, their faces stiff with terror. Others are noble daughters, ripped from their beds under cover of night, their jeweled anklets still dangling as signs of their stolen privilege. A few are gladiators, their bodies scarred from the arena, forced now to perform on a stage of flesh rather than sand. Together they stumble into the emperor's gaze, stripped of dignity, stripped of choice. At the center of the hall stands Commodus. His body gleams with oil, lion skin draped across his shoulders, the club of Hercules in his right hand. He struts before his captives, every step echoing on the marble floor, every movement calculated to proclaim that he is God made flesh. His laugh rings high and sharp, almost childlike in its cruelty. He drinks deeply from a goblet of Falernian wine, spilling it deliberately onto the naked skin of a trembling girl. The liquid trails across her thighs, pooling on the cold stone beneath her feet. Commodus grins, as if he has blessed her with a baptism of his own design. Senators sit frozen on couches along the walls, invited or condemned to witness. They sip from goblets with trembling hands, their faces fixed in masks of false delight. To look away is treason, to show disgust is death. Cassius Dio, one of those senators, would later write that the empire itself decayed under Commodus's lusts. He observed not merely with the eye of a historian, but with the horror of a man who knew that Rome's soul was being strangled before him. Music begins, low and sinister. Lyres plucked by trembling slaves weave thin strands of melody into the thick air. Flutes cry like birds in a cage. The rhythm is set by a drum, its beat, steady as a heartbeat, pounding in time with the fear that fills the chamber. Commodus raises his arms, the lion pelt shifting on his back, and declares himself Hercules reborn. His voice cracks against the stone, amplified by the cavernous halls. He demands worship not through prayer, but through submission. The captives are forced into obscene positions, their bodies arranged like statues in a grotesque parody of divine myth. Gladiators are ordered to reenact Hercules' labors, not with beasts but with women, their cries silenced by the lash. Blood from wounds mingles with spilled wine, forming dark stains on the polished marble. Slaves pour libations across the floor, the scent of sour grapes mingling with sweat and iron. For Commodus, this is ritual, this is Rome. Outside, the Tiber slides black beneath the moon, carrying whispers of plague and famine. In the city's markets, bakers argue over dwindling grain, mothers cradle starving children, and priests beg the gods for deliverance. But here, within the emperor's palace, reality dissolves into nightmare. Commodus believes that as Hercules, he sustains the cosmos itself, that his pleasures are Rome's blessings. Every body he conquers becomes proof of his immortality. Every scream is an anthem to his divinity. And you, standing in the torchlight, heart pounding, throat dry, cannot look away. You smell the sweat on the captives, the smoke of torches, the sweet sour stench of spilled Falernian. You see senators' faces pale with terror, their eyes glassy as if hypnotized. You hear Commodus's shriek of laughter, echoing like the cry of a bird of prey. This is not entertainment. It is domination, staged on the most intimate battlefield, the human body. For Rome, these nights are more than scandal. They are omens. The empire that once prided itself on discipline, law, and piety now kneels before an emperor who mocks gods and men alike. And the question that spreads in whispers through the taverns and baths, through the villas and the slums, is simple. How long can Rome endure when its master has turned its heart into a theatre of lust and horror? This is the beginning, the first glimpse into the most horrific sexual practices of Commodus the Cruel, the emperor who claimed the mantle of Hercules but left Rome in ruins. Picture this. The year is 161 AD. In the imperial villa at Lanuvium, south of Rome, twin infants cry out against the silence of marble halls. One of them, Titus Aurelius Fulvus Antoninus, dies before his 4th year. The other, Lucius Aurelius Commodus, survives. He will grow to inherit not just his father's throne, but the destiny of an empire. From the beginning, the omens are twisted. Romans believe twins represent duality, harmony and discord, balance and chaos. One twin dies, and all imbalance falls into the body of the other. Commodus grows as a boy already marked by shadow. His father, Marcus Aurelius, is the philosopher emperor. Stoic, disciplined, a ruler who writes at night about duty and virtue, about the need to restrain appetite and master desire. The world will remember him for his meditations, lines of serene wisdom etched into the memory of mankind. Yet wisdom does not always pass from father to son. Marcus spends his reign on campaign along the Danube, fighting wars of survival against Germanic tribes. He raises Commodus, not in the libraries of Rome, but in military camps filled with mud, disease, and the screams of barbarians dying beneath Roman steel. It is here that Commodus grows, surrounded not by philosophers but by soldiers, prostitutes, slaves, and the smell of blood. Ancient sources describe a boy quick to anger, prone to cruelty. Cassius Dio tells the story of a servant who prepared Commodus's bath at the wrong temperature. The boy ordered the man thrown into the furnace. He was barely 12 years old. Where his father sought self-mastery, Commodus sought domination. Where Marcus Aurelius cultivated philosophy, Commodus cultivated appetite. His pleasures were physical, immediate, and without restraint. In 177 AD, Marcus Aurelius elevates Commodus to co-emperor. Rome trembles at the thought. Never before has such power been placed into hands so young, so untested, so corruptible. Marcus believes bloodline ensures continuity, but in truth it ensures disaster. When the philosopher-emperor dies in 180 AD at Vindobona, modern Vienna, the legions mourn. They whisper prayers to the gods. Rome has lost a sage. In his place rises a beast. Commodus is 19. He abandons his father's war at the frontiers and rushes to Rome. Soldiers left behind die of disease and despair, their pay withheld as their emperor pours gold into spectacles. The Senate, weary of war, welcomes him at first. Rome craves peace, and Commodus gives it to them, but at a terrible cost. Peace not as discipline, but as decay. Peace not as prosperity, but as indulgence. Almost immediately, Commodus begins to style himself not as an emperor of men, but as a god among mortals. He orders statues of Hercules recarved with his own features. He drapes himself in lion skin, takes up the club, and parades through the streets as the demigod reborn. He names himself Hercules Romanus, protector of the world. But Hercules in myth was a figure of strength tempered by duty. Commodus twists the legend into parody. For him, Hercules is not the hero who labors for mankind, but the predator who devours it. He renames the months of the year after himself. He renames the legions of Rome as Commodianae. He even renames Rome itself, calling it Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. To him, the eternal city is nothing more than his possession, as pliable as a concubine bent beneath him. At first, the people cheer. Commodus is young, handsome, strong. He entertains them with endless games in the Colosseum. Unlike emperors before him, he does not watch from the imperial box he fights. Or so he pretends. Dressed as a gladiator, Commodus slaughters opponents carefully chosen to ensure his triumph. Cripples, prisoners, beasts, drugged or chained. He demands applause as if it were worship, demanding that Romans acknowledge not merely his rule but his divinity. Yet behind these spectacles, something darker grows. The arena is only half the theatre. The other half is hidden in palace halls, where Commodus transforms sexual appetite into political ritual. Gladiators fresh from the arena are forced into obscene acts with courtesans before the emperor's eyes. Noble women are dragged into chambers and humiliated, their suffering a warning to husbands in the Senate. Slaves are paraded naked in torchlight, arranged as grotesque reenactments of Hercules' labors. Commodus's obsession with Hercules bleeds into every ritual. Where Hercules slew the Nemean lion, Commodus rapes women dressed in lion skins. Where Hercules carried the world on his shoulders, Commodus demands orgies in which bodies pile atop one another until his concubines collapse. Where Hercules conquered Amazons, Commodus forces senators' wives to dress in armor before stripping them publicly. The mythology of Rome becomes the pornography of its emperor. For the Senate, these nights are torture. They are forced to attend, to clap, to drink, to smile. They sit stiff on couches as their own families are degraded, knowing that to protest is to die. They whisper prayers to Jupiter, to Mars, to any god who will listen, but none answer. The gods, it seems, have abandoned Rome. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the empire rots. Plague spreads in provinces neglected by their emperor. Grain shipments from Africa dwindle, while Commodus drains the treasury on fountains of wine poured over naked bodies. Soldiers on the frontier desert, unpaid, unled, unvalued. The people in the streets murmur that Rome itself is cursed, that the empire's greatness is being bled out in the Colosseum's sands and the palace's orgy halls. Commodus rules for 12 years. Each year, his delusions grow. He orders citizens executed for failing to praise him as Hercules. He arranges marriages only to break them with public humiliations. He forces the Vestal virgins, once sacred guardians of Rome's purity, into his ceremonies, mocking their vows. He does not merely corrupt individuals. He corrupts the very institutions of Rome, religion, family, honor, bending them into his theater of lust. By the late 182nd, Rome lives in fear. Not fear of foreign invasion, not fear of famine or plague, but fear of its emperor. Every family whispers, "Will my son be dragged to serve in his spectacles? Will my daughter vanish into the palace? Will tonight be the night I am summoned to witness, to clap, to drink, to die?" This is the backdrop against which Commodus's most horrific sexual practices unfold. The empire that Marcus Aurelius built with philosophy and blood has become the plaything of his son. Rome, once the conqueror of the world, is now enslaved by the appetites of one man who calls himself Hercules but acts as a monster. Picture this: the Colosseum not in daylight, where thousands roar for blood, but at night. Torches line the arches, their flames licking the stone like hungry tongues. A hush falls across the empty seats as guards usher in a different kind of audience: senators, priests, merchants, chosen or condemned. They sit stiffly, forced to watch as Commodus strides onto the sand, not in the armor of a general, but in lion's skin, club in hand, eyes gleaming with madness. This arena, built for gladiators and beasts, is now his bedroom, and all Rome is invited to watch. The emperor's obsession with Hercules is no game. He commands his victims to reenact the labors of the mythic hero, but in obscene pantomime. Where Hercules fought lions, Commodus orders women dressed in pelts, crawling on all fours, only to be beaten and forced into degradation. Where Hercules slew the Hydra, Commodus surrounds himself with chained captives, demanding acts of submission repeated again and again until exhaustion collapses them. Where Hercules conquered the Amazons, Commodus takes noble women wives and daughters of senators and forces them to don armor, parade as warriors, then strips them naked before the jeering guards. Every myth becomes parody, every ritual a defilement. Cassius Dio records that Commodus would take dozens of partners in a single night, both men and women, demanding that they worship him as a god. He forced gladiators to violate concubines under his gaze, turning warriors into rapists, victims into spectacle. The sand of the arena was slick not only with the blood of beasts, but with the fluids of human humiliation. And Commodus laughed high, shrill, childlike, yet more chilling than any roar of a lion. Within the Palatine Palace, orgies bled into the architecture itself. Fountains of marble flowed not with water but with wine, poured over naked bodies arranged as living statues. Slaves painted in gold and silver sprawled across couches, their mouths stuffed with grapes, their bodies offered as banquets of flesh. Musicians played lyres and flutes, their hands trembling as they scored melodies for screams. The emperor walked among them like a director, striking his concubines with his club, demanding they play the roles he assigned: Hercules' captives, mythical beasts, even gods forced to submit. Witnesses whisper of acts too grotesque to imagine. Prostitutes forced to crawl through chestnuts scattered across the floor, their bodies illuminated by torchlight as Commodus hurled taunts. Senators' sons paraded in women's clothing, ordered to dance before the emperor until their shame became unbearable. Priests dragged into chambers to bless the orgies as if they were holy rites, mouths speaking hymns while their eyes brimmed with tears. To Commodus, these degradations were not excess, they were proof that he was divine, that Rome itself was his slave, that no god or man stood above him. The emperor's cruelty extended to punishment. Those who resisted his desires faced death, but not swiftly. Women accused of defiance were bound to stakes in the arena, stripped naked, and forced to endure public humiliation. Commodus would enter dressed as Hercules, staging mock battles where gladiators pretended to slay beasts while instead defiling their captives. Senators were made to watch as their families screamed, paralyzed by fear, unable to intervene. Resistance was treason, silence was survival. One account tells of a lion brought into the chamber, its claws dulled, its body drugged. Commodus slaughtered the animal with his club, then turned to the trembling captives, demanding they mimic the beast's submission. Another night, he brought in Vestal virgins, sacred keepers of Rome's purity, and mocked their vows by forcing them into obscene dances, their sacred status desecrated before all. Herodian later wrote that never before had Rome seen such corruption, that Commodus transformed every symbol of piety into parody, every tradition into theatre for his lust. The psychological terror was as powerful as the physical. Senators left these feasts broken, their authority stripped along with their dignity. Citizens whispered in baths and taverns of the emperor who used their daughters as playthings, their sons as jesters. Mothers prayed their children would not be chosen. Fathers lived in dread that one summons from the palace would destroy their family forever. Yet Commodus was tireless. He demanded fresh victims each night, boys from the streets, women from noble villas, slaves dragged from farms. To him, variety was the spice of divinity. His pleasures had no boundaries, only stages. The Colosseum one night, the palace the next. A senator's villa, seized for entertainment another. Rome itself became his harem, its people reduced to props in his endless theatre of flesh. And through it all, Commodus believed himself Hercules, each conquest proof of his godhood, each scream a hymn, each degradation a sacrifice. Where his father had written of self-control and reason, Commodus declared that desire itself was divine, that appetite was law, that the human body was Rome's true currency. This was not merely debauchery. It was ritual designed to bend Rome's soul beneath the weight of one man's lust. Ritual that transformed intimacy into domination, sex into conquest, religion into pornography. In Commodus's Rome, flesh replaced faith, appetite replaced justice, and the emperor's bed became the empire's altar. Picture this: Rome in the last years of the 2nd century AD. By day, the streets still throng with merchants, slaves, and pilgrims, the Tiber carrying barges of grain through the city's heart. But by night, the eternal city whispers. In taverns, in bathhouses, in the smoky corners of markets, people murmur stories of their emperor, Commodus the Cruel, who defiles wives, enslaves sons, mocks gods, and drinks as if each cup were a libation poured for himself. The empire has seen tyrants before. Nero burned Rome's streets and staged grotesque plays. Caligula built bridges of boats and declared himself divine. Domitian ruled with paranoia and executions, but never before had Rome's very body been weaponized. Under Commodus, the institutions that gave Rome its identity, family, law, faith, were turned into instruments of lust. The Colosseum, once the symbol of civic pride, became a brothel of humiliation. The Palatine, once the seat of power, became an altar of flesh. The sacred Vestal virgins were mocked. Senators sat in silence as their households were ravaged. To resist was to die. To survive was to endure shame. Cassius Dio, writing decades later, could barely find words to capture the decay. He wrote that Rome's soul itself was enslaved. Each spectacle of Commodus left the city emptier, drained not only of dignity but of faith. Citizens stopped believing in justice. Priests prayed with hollow voices. Their gods mocked too openly to be revered. Even soldiers muttered in camps, their pay withheld as the treasury bled into endless orgies and spectacles. Rome had once conquered nations with discipline. Now its emperor conquered his own people with appetite. Beyond the walls, the provinces felt the weight. On the frontiers along the Rhine and Danube, garrisons starved. Governors sent desperate pleas for reinforcements, but Commodus answered only with festivals. Grain from Africa rotted as corruption infested the ports. Rebellions flared in Britain, uprisings in Gaul, bandit kings rose in the deserts of Syria. The empire teetered while its emperor staged himself as Hercules reborn, slaughtering chained beasts and captives while demanding worship. The Senate seethed in silence. Noble families trembled each time a messenger summoned them to the palace, uncertain whether they would be guests or victims. Fathers taught their daughters to feign sickness, to limp, to scar themselves, anything to avoid being chosen. Mothers clutched their sons, praying they would not be dressed as Amazons or satyrs for Commodus's grotesque plays. But prayers were powerless. The emperor's will was law. Rome's streets began to curdle with rumor. Some whispered that Commodus had lost his mind entirely, that he no longer distinguished himself from Hercules. Others whispered darker, that he believed himself not merely God, but Rome itself. He had renamed the months after his titles. He had renamed the city Colonia Commodiana. He had demanded that statues of Hercules be carved with his face. Citizens whispered, "If the emperor is Rome, then Rome is already damned." Plots began to take root. In shadowed chambers, senators, generals, even slaves shared the same thought. Commodus must die. But to kill an emperor was to strike at the heart of divinity. Failure meant not just death, but annihilation, families wiped out, names erased, memory damned. So the conspiracies spread slowly, like rot beneath gilded paint. The first attempt came from senators who placed poison in Commodus's food, but he vomited it out, his body hardened by years of indulgence. Later, whispers tell of concubines who tried to suffocate him in his sleep, but his guards caught them and their corpses were dragged through the streets. Fear deepened, yet so too did determination. The final conspiracy was born in the very bedchamber of the emperor. His favorite concubine, Marcia, once forced into his orgies, now seethed with hatred. She had endured enough humiliation to last a lifetime, and she saw the empire itself dissolving under Commodus's cruelty. Alongside her were the chamberlain Eclectus and the praetorian prefect Laetus. Together they forged a plan: poison his wine. On the 31st of December, 192 AD, Commodus prepared for another night of ritual. He intended to enter the arena on New Year's Day, not as emperor, but as gladiator, demanding worship from all Rome. He had ordered executions, orgies, spectacles, his reign's final desecration. Marcia handed him a goblet of wine laced with poison. He drank, and soon his body rebelled. He vomited violently, collapsing in fury. The poison had failed to kill him, and rage filled his eyes. He vowed to execute his conspirators at dawn. Panic spread among them. They turned to a gladiator named Narcissus, a man who had trained Commodus in combat. That night, in the steam of the palace baths, Narcissus wrapped his hands around the emperor's throat. Commodus struggled, clawed, gasped, but years of indulgence had softened him. The god-king, the new Hercules, was strangled like a common criminal. His body twitched, then stilled. In that moment, Rome exhaled, but relief was shadowed by ruin. The conspirators rushed to proclaim a new emperor, but the empire itself was fractured. The Senate denounced Commodus as a tyrant, erasing his name from monuments, chiseling his titles from stone. Statues were toppled, coins melted. His reign was declared a disgrace, but no decree could erase the memory of what had been endured. Rome was forever altered. The army, once loyal to discipline, had tasted corruption. The Senate, once guardian of dignity, had become voyeurs by force. Religion, once the spine of civic life, had been prostituted on palace floors. Commodus's death ended his tyranny, but it also marked the end of Rome's golden century. Historians would later look back and declare that with Commodus's reign, the empire began its decline. The rot had entered the marrow. His cruelty left scars not only on victims but on Rome itself. Citizens who survived carried memories of screams in torchlight, of humiliation endured in silence, of prayers unanswered as gods were mocked. Parents told their children stories not of Rome's glory but of Commodus' nights, warnings wrapped in whispers. And the empire, though it endured for centuries more, never again recaptured the discipline of Marcus Aurelius. It staggered forward, weakened, wounded, haunted. Commodus the Cruel had died, but his shadow lingered. The empire had stared into the abyss of appetite made law, and it had blinked. Picture this. The Colosseum stands today as a hollowed skeleton of stone, its arches gaping like the sockets of a skull. Tourists shuffle along its corridors, cameras clicking, guides reciting tales of gladiators and emperors. The sunlight falls where once torches blazed, and the sand of the arena is quiet. But history whispers. If you pause, if you close your eyes, the silence is broken by echoes, the crack of whips, the shriek of laughter, the moans of captives turned into props. Beneath the ruins lies memory, and memory does not decay. Commodus is gone, strangled in a bath on the final day of 192 AD. His statues were toppled, his name condemned. Rome tried to erase him, but the empire could not erase what he had done. The Senate declared him a tyrant, the soldiers abandoned his corpse, and the gods mocked too long remained silent. Yet Commodus achieved something no emperor before him had managed. He turned Rome itself into his theatre of lust, a civilization bent into the shape of one man's appetite. What does it mean when power escapes all restraint? Marcus Aurelius, Commodus's father, had written that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. If so, Commodus's soul dyed Rome in crimson. The empire's institutions were perverted. Justice became farce, faith became parody, family became currency. Senators, once guardians of law, were reduced to voyeurs of their own humiliation. Priests, once servants of gods, were compelled to sanctify obscenity. Citizens, once proud of their discipline, whispered like slaves in their own streets. Rome staggered on for centuries after Commodus. Emperors rose and fell. Armies marched, cities burned, provinces were lost and reclaimed. But historians agree, the Golden Age ended with him. The rot set in not only at the borders but at the core. Rome learned that it could survive famine, plague, and invasion. What it could not survive was the corrosion of its own soul. And here is the horror. Commodus's reign is not just a relic of antiquity, it is a mirror. His practices, the ritualized humiliation, the turning of sex into spectacle, the worship of appetite, are not confined to marble ruins. They are warnings. Warnings about what happens when desire becomes law, when rulers turn people into props, when institutions designed to protect are twisted into theater. Every civilization carries within it the seeds of Commodus, the temptation to trade virtue for indulgence, discipline for spectacle, humanity for domination. The Colosseum whispers still. Beneath the chatter of tourists and the shuffle of shoes, it holds the screams of women dressed as beasts, the laughter of senators forced to watch, the hollow moans of gladiators degraded into actors. Stones remember what men would forget. Each arch, each corridor, each crack in the marble is heavy with echoes. History buries its dead, but never buries its warnings. Close your eyes as you stand in the arena, and you will hear it. The shrill laugh of an emperor who called himself Hercules, the whimper of a captive as chains bite into her flesh, the silence of senators too afraid to speak. These are not just stories. They are reminders that the line between civilization and spectacle is thinner than we believe. Rome crossed it and fell. Commodus died, believing himself a god. In truth, he was a mirror of humanity's darkest hunger, and if his ghost lingers, it does not linger in the marble ruins of Rome, but in every moment when power escapes restraint, when lust devours dignity, when appetite rules the soul. So the Colosseum stands not only as ruin, but as warning. Its arches, scarred by time, call to us across centuries. Beware the hunger of men who think themselves gods. Beware the laughter that mocks suffering. Beware the empire of flesh, for it rots faster than stone. This is the legacy of Commodus the Cruel, not merely an emperor, but a spectre proof that even the greatest civilizations can collapse, not by enemies at their gates, but by appetites enthroned at their heart.